Hello, it's Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Breanne Tidemann, who is the weed science research scientist at Lacombe, or one of them. And today we're talking about weed resistance to chemicals and herbicides.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So, Breanne, can you tell me when did weed resistance kind of rear its ugly head?
So if you actually dig back into the records, I think the very first herbicide-resistant weed in Canada was in like 1954 or something like that. So
Really?
It's actually a really long-term problem. When we really saw it start spiking, would probably be closer to the 80s and 90s as our reliance on herbicides increased. And I would say particularly in through the 90s as we moved into a real reliance on herbicides as we moved into no-till as well.
Okay. So what was the first weed that showed resistance? I'm curious.
Oh, you're testing my memory skills here, Harry. I want to say it was wild carrot in Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I want to say it was resistance to 2,4-D, but I could be really making that up at the same time.
There wasn't a heck of a lot of choices back then.
No.
And is it a problem just in Canada?
No, we are actually third in the world in terms of herbicide resistance. So we take the bronze medal right now in terms of herbicide resistance cases, with the United States taking the gold medal and Australia taking the silver. I think I've got that correct. But it's really a global problem. Anywhere that's doing cropping systems agriculture that are using herbicides have seen some sort of selection for herbicide resistant weeds. And in some cases, those that say they don't have it maybe just also aren't looking. So
it's like
there's a little bit of that aspect that comes into play now and again too.
If I'm not looking, I see nothing. I see nothing.
Exactly. If you're not looking for it, it's pretty hard to find. So
yeah. Well, we've become so reliant on it, as especially now that we've gone to zero tillage is pretty much predisposed on one herbicide, which is glyphosate.
That's really been a big factor in terms of burn downs, particularly pre-seed burn downs. But before we were doing no-till, we were using tillage, whether that was for crop residue management or seed bank management, but there was also weed control benefits of some of those practices. When we didn't have as good of herbicides, we utilized a lot more cultural management, whether that was delayed seeding or, a different cropping rotation. Using summer fallow was a weed management practice.
I remember
that was
when
used,
I was younger, there was a lot of guys, cultivating 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, even in the black soil zone.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just being able to continuous crop, being able to do no-till has taken away the need for a lot of those practices. And it's pretty hard to keep a farmer doing something that's going to cost them time or money or efficiency when they don't have to. Like it's an argument I completely understand. Is why would we make this harder than we have to?
Oh yeah. Why spend money you don't have to? That's seen as non-productive, right?
Yeah.
Well, could you maybe explain a little bit about the herbicide groups? Because that's kind of what the whole thing's based is. You have to use that as a tool.
Yeah, so the way herbicides are categorized is basically where in the plant or what enzyme in the plant they work on. So as an example, our graminicides or our grass herbicides, those are group 1s. They work on the ACCase enzyme within grass weeds. Our group 2s work on the ALS enzyme. So they work on very specific enzymes within the plant. And so the reason that we talk about rotating herbicide groups or herbicide modes of action is that then you're not selecting for changes within those specific enzymes, which can result in herbicide resistance.
And how easy is it to develop resistance if it's only one specific enzyme in the cell or in the plant?
So there's actually a lot of variability and a lot of different factors that affect how easy it is to develop resistance. So which herbicide group is involved depending on how complex the target is or how the herbicides interact with the enzyme can affect how easy it is, which weed species involved, those weed species that are more genetically diverse or outcross more or have more mixing between populations, those tend to develop resistance more easily. We also see resistance increase more quickly in weeds that have shorter seed banks. There's a lot of various factors, including how easy it is for a plant to develop a mutation where the plant can still grow and live, but it can survive the herbicide. So as an example, when we were looking for glyphosate-resistant crops for Roundup-ready crops, there was a lot of work put in, and it was really difficult to find any kind of mutation or change to the enzyme that glyphosate targets to allow those plants to still grow while being resistant to glyphosate. Because in a lot of cases, any change in that enzyme also meant the plant couldn't grow because the normal function of that enzyme couldn't happen.
Right.
So we kind of went, well, then the weeds are never going to be able to evolve resistance. It's too hard to develop this mutation. We have a tendency to underestimate weeds. What the weeds did instead was just made a whole bunch more of those enzymes. So it said, I don't have to change the enzyme. I'll just weigh way too much of it that you simply can't hit all of it at an economical rate. So that's one of the ways we've seen glyphosate resistance develop, is a whole bunch more of the enzyme instead of a change to the enzyme.
I kind of call that, personally, I call that the Xerox method of doing an end run. Yeah. And I was just getting to point out, like with the group 1 and group 2 herbicides, because it is such a specific enzyme, it was a little easier for resistance to develop.
So the group 2s are actually really interesting, and this is going fairly deep into some herbicide mode of action physiology, but I'll try not to get too technical with it. The way that the herbicides interact with the enzyme, they interact with the enzyme in a different place than the normal molecules that the enzyme works with interacts. Right. So it's in a completely different place. So the enzyme can change where the herbicide binds without changing where the normal stuff binds. So it can actually change its configuration. So the herbicide can't bind, but it can still do its thing normally in the plant and keep growing. So that's one of the reasons why group 2 herbicides are one of our high risk categories, because that enzyme can have changes in its configuration without actually changing how it interacts normally with the plant.
So because I was thinking how group 2s have probably the greatest spectrum of weeds that have shown resistance, right?
Yeah, and there is a lot of mutations like those, my molecular colleagues that have dug into the actual like single amino acid mutations, so specific mutations, there is a lot of them for group 2s that can result in resistance to the herbicide, but the plant still functions. So there's a lot of options for that enzyme to change.
Yeah, it's like, it's an invitation. Go ahead, change me.
Yeah.
And then especially with group 2s, because I think of herbicides we can use with peas.
Yeah.
And we are very, very reliant, both for broadleafs as well as grassy weeds, on group 2 herbicides.
Yes. Yeah. So group 2 resistance, and it's interesting as well, and some people have heard me rant about this before, but seeing marketing for herbicide products that are marketed specifically to help you manage resistance, but it's a group 2 plus something.
Yeah, I know.
It's like, but you're not really, you're not doing multiple modes of action. You're using just that group 4 or group 6 or whatever happens to be in there, because the group 2 part doesn't work.
Right.
But that's another topic that I can get on a soapbox.
I feel your pain.
Yeah. It gets frustrating talking to farmers because they think they're doing the right thing without realizing that marketing can be a little bit misleading sometimes.
And it's getting so complicated. I used to do the Blue Book, right? And there is such a proliferation of generic products with a different name, the same active ingredient. So really, as a producer, you need to know what the active ingredient is and the group that it comes from to really put in a proper rotation of herbicide to address any resistance issues.
And that's, I guess, from the research side, we're kind of lucky because the trade names are different between Canada and the US and Australia. We cannot use trade names because they're all something different. So we have to rely on the active ingredient. But that means I'm horrible when a farmer comes to me and say, I sprayed this. I'm like, what's in it? I don't know what that is. You got to give me the ingredient. Sorry, I really should be better on my trade names, but they're not useful anywhere else. So
it's a case too where every year doing the blue book, there looks like there's 30, 40 different new products coming on the market, but in actual fact, all they are generics. So if you've got 12 or 14 products that have clonidifot propargyl, it's still just the same product. Yeah, marketing is really a lot of BS as far as I can.
Yeah, it can make the farmer's job a whole heck of a lot harder when all they want to do is put in a good weed management strategy. The marketing does not always help. In fact, I would say most times it hurts in some cases.
Yeah, and human nature is you keep using something as long as it works until it doesn't work any longer. Then you pull the next tool out of the box.
Yes.
And we're kind of running short of tools in some of our weeds, like kochia, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Kochia's, well, I tend to bug Charles Geddes a lot with Ag Canada Lethbridge. That I'm glad he's in Lethbridge and I'm in Lacombe because I don't have to deal so much with kochia yet. It's his problem, not mine. But yeah, kochia's a bit of a real pain in the butt because it's one that seems to not only fairly quickly develop resistance, but it also spreads really quickly. Yes. So once we start seeing like glyphosate resistance in Alberta is a good example. It was found in 2012, confirmed in 2012.
Yeah.
And it was about 5% of populations when they surveyed. And when it was surveyed again in 2017, it was over 50% of the populations.
Holy
so it's not kidding around when it starts to establish. It moves quickly.
I know of at least one patch in our own county that has got glyphosate resistance. And usually when it's kochia, it's usually group 2 resistant. Well, you can just about guarantee it's group 2 resistant.
Yeah.
And also group 4.
Yeah.
So
well, it's funny because really we don't test kochia for ALS or group 2 resistance anymore. It's just assumed. Yeah. We just assume it's resistant because it got to be that there was really no point in testing. And unfortunately, that appears to be the direction we're going with glyphosate resistance as well, is that it's just all going to be eventually.
Yeah, which is, it's a little dismaying from the point of view of agronomy. It means that what is easy to do and just pick your chemical and use it is not going to be the same in the future. So what are your suggestions to deal with the resistance issues?
Well, a lot of my suggestions are something that can be challenging for producers. And again, I understand that.
Yeah.
But those IWM strategies that we talk about with crop rotation and increased seeding rates and looking at other non-chemical tools, we really got to be looking at them before we absolutely need them. Yeah, so by using them before we don't have herbicide options, we can hopefully extend the length of time that our herbicides are actually useful because we're using these other tools to keep the populations in check.
Yeah.
But if we don't start trying to use them until populations are out of control, that's asking a whole lot from non-chemical tools to try and bring those populations back under control.
Yeah, it's kind of like shutting the barn door after the horses are gone, right?
Yeah.
It's too little too late.
Yeah, and I mean, I know I'm right there with the farmers hoping that the chem companies will come out with something new, some new herbicide group that we haven't had before, and it will work great in all of our crops and on all of these target weeds. But the problem is, even if we get a new group, I don't know, 45, because we'll never get that high. So we'll say group 45, what's everyone going to do? Oh, this works really well and there's no resistance to it. That's what I'm going to use.
So
then we all start using it. And up goes the selection pressure, and that's exactly how we're going to find the next resistance to that group 45. So we don't need just one new product. We need about 5 new products, 5 new modes of action that we can rotate through to try and keep all of them viable, because one new alone is not going to do it.
Or what we need actually is a change in mindset of producers so that they are aware of the problem before it becomes almost an insurmountable issue.
Yeah.
And use the tools we already have available. I know they're not sexy and they cost more.
Or they take more effort, or they're not that easy to do. Yeah.
Well, this is a good year. When you think of it, oftentimes people will restrict their crop rotation to very few crops because nothing makes money except for these two crops, right? Well, this is a year where everything's looking profitable.
Yep.
So, break the cycle and use something different with a different chemical.
Well, and I'm not, even with something like seeding rates, do I really have to go and double my seeding rate across my entire field? No. Double your seeding rate in your bad patches where those weeds are really concentrated. If patch management works for you, do that. It's better than not doing it at all.
Right. With the double seeding rate, how would that work in the brown or dark brown soil zones where moisture is limiting?
Well, that's a good question. All of the research that I've seen from Neil, from in the literature, it seems to be globally, regardless of soil zone, regardless of country, regardless of crop, increasing your seeding rate results in fewer weeds. So the goal there is to take up that niche with the crop instead of having the weeds grow and competing for that moisture. So if you don't have the extra crop there, your weeds are going to be there sucking up that moisture anyways.
Yeah.
Right. So you will get less tillers on your crop. You might get more single stems instead of tillering, which, hey, maybe it'll help your maturities too. I don't know.
Even it out a bit.
Yeah. It's really hard if you're in a real drought situation. Like I know some of southern Alberta is predicted for right now. That might be a harder sell. But again, if you can do it, if you've got a bad kochia patch or a bad wild oat patch, why not try and give your crop some advantage there?
That's a good idea. Don't do the whole field. Just do those problem patches.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah. What about one thing over the years, people have asked questions about, what about row spacing? Because I noticed that with air seeders, oftentimes they'll tend to go to wider and wider row spacings to avoid hairpinning and problems with it plugging up from the straw.
So everything that we know about row spacing, at least in theory, suggests that the wider rows give a lot more opportunity to weeds.
Right.
Row spacing can be really hard to work with in the field because unless you have a seeder that's got actual adjustable row spacing, which we don't have.
No.
Even if you go from a 9-inch to a 12-inch conserva pack, we have both in Lacombe. We can do 9-inch rows and 12-inch rows, but they pack differently. The soil gets distributed differently. There are other differences between those seeders. Like we see differences in our crop emergence between those seeders because of how the soil gets packed on top of the rows. So there's other factors besides just that row spacing, which could then also affect how your weeds are coming up. Right. And so the literature on row spacing, it shows that most of the time narrower rows are more competitive.
Right.
It's not in every case. It's not as consistent as effective seeding rate, but I think that's because of some of those difficulties of actually only changing your row spacing. Right. Which is really hard to do.
It's hard to just isolate that
actual effect.
And then I guess if you're zero tilling with a very narrow disc, if you're not disturbing that soil in between the rows, there is the potential that you'll get reduced weed growth there.
In theory, you should. It's something I would really love to look at. I had a proposal on it that didn't get funded last year to look at knife openers versus disc openers versus paired row openers. Because paired row is another thing that we've got quite a few farmers using.
Yeah.
And I can't even in my mind logic out what the overall impact of a paired row opener would be. Because you're getting increased disturbance because it's a paired row.
Right.
But you're also spreading out your crop competition, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So I can't decide what the overall impact of a paired row would be. So I'd love to look at it, but I haven't got there yet.
One of these days.
One of these days. It's in the list of, a gazillion research ideas. So
yeah, it'll keep you going until you're old and gray.
One will hope so. As long as people will actually fund those ideas.
So what can people, wild oats is an area that there's been a lot of people starting to take notice that people got both group 1 and group 2 resistance.
Yep.
I haven't seen any glyphosate resistance yet in Canada, but the first wild oats showed up with resistance in Australia. So it's only a matter of time.
Correct. I think one of our biggest concerns around glyphosate resistant wild oats in Canada is that when farmers have group 1 and 2 resistance, and those wild oat densities get high, what's one of our strategies is we switch to Roundup Ready canola as a cleanup year for the wild oats. But the way selection pressure works, herbicide resistance is completely a numbers game. So the more individuals that you apply that herbicide to, the more likely you are to find that one unique individual that can survive the application.
And then your selection game's on.
And then that individual survives, it's set seed, and now you've got a resistant population starting to establish.
Yeah.
So when we're using that glyphosate as our cleanup year, that scares me a little bit because we're putting a lot of selection pressure on that glyphosate in that year, especially when we're using it as a cleanup to manage group 1 and 2 resistance.
So it's been interesting. I've been around long enough that I've seen things kind of come, they went, and then they've come back in again, right?
Yes.
So it's interesting to see most of the new active ingredients or so-called new active ingredients have been a lot of pre-seed preparations or soil applied products. And I was thinking of Avidex, and which is it was good back in the 70s, 1970s.
Yep.
And then we kind of overused it and got resistance. Was there enough time there between then and basically a big break of time where hardly anyone ever used it, that it would have reduced or eliminated the resistant populations?
So trialate resistance is actually one of the really interesting resistance biotypes because there was a fitness penalty associated with that resistance biotype.
Okay.
So the only reason we would expect to see a decrease in a resistance biotype over time is if there's actually a fitness penalty. Because if there's not a fitness penalty, if it doesn't hurt the biotype to have that resistance, why would it get rid of it? Why would that start to be diminished? Trialate resistance or Avidex resistance, there was actually a fitness penalty. And I spent some time talking to John O'Donovan about this before he retired. And so his opinion was that we would have seen a decrease in the frequency of that biotype.
Okay.
How much of a decrease? He wasn't sure. And how many years of utility of the molecule we would have back, he wasn't overly confident about that either. He does not see Avidex necessarily being a long-term tool for us, especially in those areas where we've had resistance previously. Yeah.
It's one of those things too that we got a lot of the new products that are coming out that are soil applied, group 14, etc.
Yep.
They don't, usually they're broadleaves.
They are primary broadleafs, yes. A lot of those that have wild oat activity, they are only registered for suppression of wild oat, not for control.
So that also has a problem because if it's only suppression, you're still putting selection pressure on those wild oats for resistance, maybe even a little quicker.
Yeah, that's a hard line to draw for. Is it even more? Are we going to get resistance more quickly? It's hard. It's really hard to delineate that. The best way, in my opinion, to use those products is when you still have in-crop herbicides that are effective. Right. So using the herbicide layering strategy, because there's not a lot of options. Like when we talk about tank mixing multiple effective modes of action in crop, that's pretty hard to do for something like wild oats. There's just not a lot of groups that are active on wild oat. So using a herbicide layering strategy where you have a residual pre, you use an in-crop that's still effective, you use your increased seeding rates, maybe you have to silage an area or mow an area so those wild oats don't set seed because you think they're resistant, but really trying to manage your full system. Like Neil showed, if you've got cattle and you have a market for barley silage, early cut barley silage a few years in a row can be very, very effective on wild oat because those wild oats don't have a chance to set seeds. So you can drive that population down.
Yeah. Well, then what you're really saying, as far as I can see, is that you're encouraging everybody to go back to a mixed farm where they have cattle so that they're working full time throughout the year.
Or make good friends with your buddies that are cattle farmers and strike up some kind of partnership.
And I've seen that happen before where guys that don't have any cattle will do a rotation with their neighbors with cattle. And certainly silaging, as you said, 2 or 3 years, does a bang up job of getting rid of some of those resistant weeds and
Yep.
dropping down the weed seed bank.
Yep. Well, and I mean, even I've talked to a producer in Manitoba that does a land swap with one of his neighbors. So he will switch one of his fields that's been in annual cropping, and his neighbor will put that into a perennial pasture for 3 or 4 years. And for 3 or 4 years, he will break and crop his neighbor's perennial pasture.
Mm-hmm.
Benefit for both. The pasture gets rejuvenated. The wild oat problems or the resistance issue gets taken care of over a couple of years as perennials and with some grazing. And it's kind of a nice swap. You better be good friends with your neighbor, and you better continue to get along for that 4-year period.
It's a long-term relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's some opportunities there. And I mean, I think with the resistance situation we're in, it's time to start thinking outside the box a little bit and trying some of those maybe unconventional ways of moving forward.
So with some of our primary herbicide-resistant weeds,
yes,
how effective is perennial forages at reducing the weed seed bank? Like I guess it's a case too that if you've got like 30 bushels per acre of wild oats in a field seed bank, it's a little too late. But how much reduction of seed bank would occur?
So when Neil ran his study on integrated weed management of wild oat, and that's one of the best studies that I've got to give you any kind of answer.
Yeah.
He had a treatment that was 3 years of alfalfa with 1 to 2 cuts a year, depending on the location. And by the end of that study, his seed bank in the alfalfa was lower than in a canola wheat rotation where the herbicides were still effective, like where there was no resistance.
Wow. Pretty darn
so
effective.
It can be very effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a case that I don't know. Unfortunately, we fight against our own human nature, which is if it's working, just keep doing it.
Well, and it's funny because Stephen Powles, who is the former director of the Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative, his advice has always been, and I don't have the exact words right, but the intention is, if what you're doing for managing your weeds is working, change it.
Not a bad idea.
Always change it.
Yeah.
Keep changing it, because if you stick with the same thing, the weeds will figure it out.
Yeah.
And we hear a lot of weeds never developed resistance to steel. Yeah, they did. They changed when they were emerging. They changed their dormancy patterns. They did.
There's still
maybe not as obviously.
Yeah. But the thing is, if it's later too, it's already got a fitness penalty because it's competing against further along cropping, right?
Yep. Well, and one of the things that was used for wild oat was delayed seeding.
Yeah.
Right, a stale seed bed technique, but there's also a yield penalty to your crop.
Exactly. Nobody wants to take that.
There's a lot of trade-offs. There's absolutely things that you can do for wild oat, but it's not going to necessarily be your ideal cropping situation.
Yeah, it's not very palatable.
No, but I think we're getting into that point where our easy button of the herbicides, they're not working anymore. And the tools that we know of, they're not an easy button. There's no negatives. There's negatives involved with some of these. They work, but it's a trade-off. Yep.
Yeah. There's cost to what? But I mean, if you've got the lowest cost is using herbicides, then you're going to have to sort of up your game a little bit, pay a little more, but still manage to stay ahead of the weeds.
Yeah. Well, and it's a pretty expensive herbicide application if it doesn't work and doesn't kill anything.
It reminds me of someone I talked to once who had weed resistance to group 2. It was, and so it was flucarbazone.
Yep. And
so he applied it, didn't work. He brought out the retailer who sold it to the agronomist, and the guy said, "Well, I'll try it again. Next year we'll try it twice." So they try it twice, nothing happens. And so then they bring out the rep, and he gives them some more free stuff, tries it again. So by the end of it, they had pretty much a pure stand of wild oats. And the guy's eventual solution to the problem was renting it to his neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is a really poor solution.
Yep.
But what about the work that's been done recently with mechanical collection of seed, and like I was thinking of the chaff destroyers.
The harvest weed seed control, my pet
Yes.
projects.
Yeah.
Excellent. So it's been a really interesting field to be involved in because it is changing so quickly. It can actually be really hard to keep up. So in Australia, the last survey that I saw, this is a few years back, had about 60% of Australian growers using some form of harvest weed seed control.
Wow.
And at that point in time, this was a 2016 or 2017 survey. They were asked, okay, are you using it now? And also, do you plan to be using it in 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
And based on that answer, 95% of producers said they plan to be using it within 5 years.
Wow.
So in Australia, and I mean, I've talked to Hugh Becky, who's of course over there now with the Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative. It's just an accepted part of the system. Mm-hmm. It's considered one of the fundamentals of the system. It is something that they have to do, is prevent the spread and the seed bank inputs of their weeds. And I mean, it makes logical sense because what seeds are going back into your seed bank? Most likely the ones with resistance.
Right.
Those are the ones that you really don't want to go back in your seed bank, right?
You want
the ones that are
bank.
still.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in terms of the work that we've been doing in Western Canada, we finished our Harrington Seed Destructor Field Project. We did our final harvest in 2019. So we did our final seedling counts and our seed bank counts, or seed bank collection, I should say, in spring of 2020. So this last summer. We are still in the process of growing out all of those samples because, of course, it's seed bank work. So you have to freeze and grow, and it takes some time. And unfortunately, I don't have a nice big greenhouse to do a whole schwack of them at once. So it's taken us some time to work through it and see how that's working. From a adoption perspective, I was really excited to hear that there were 4 seed terminators, which is one of the brands of the impact mills. 4 of them running in Saskatchewan this past harvest. And there will be, based on discussions with some of those farmers, there will be potentially up to 9 units of that particular brand running in Saskatchewan by this fall, by 2021.
That's a significant investment.
It is. And then in speaking with some of the other brands, they also had 4 or 5 units running in the prairies. So we're talking potentially up to 15 units running in the prairies by this fall, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
I know I've heard a lot of feedback in terms of things like kochia. Yeah. So leaving the patch, coming back and making sure the combine that goes through the kochia patch has one of those mills on there so that you're not spreading that patch. Right. And even with wild oat, we hear a lot of feedback that, wild oat shatters too early. There's no point in using these on wild oat. But the one farmer that I've spent a lot of time chatting with, he uses it specifically where there's wild oat so that wild oat patch doesn't get any bigger.
So it basically contains it.
Yeah, because any of those wild oat seeds that fell, those are falling right around the parent plant typically. Right. Wild oat doesn't really spread. It's not like kochia that's going to tumble for 3 miles kind of thing. They're going to fall right there. So how does your wild oat patch get bigger? It's equipment. It's when you go through it with the seeder, when you go through it with the harrows, when you go through it with the combine. So Steve Shirtliff did work in his PhD, I think it was, that showed wild oats from a combine can be spread up to 200 meters. Like 200 meters plus. 200 meters was as far as we measured, if I remember correctly. So you can get significant expansion of a patch, even if there's only a few seeds that you're spreading 200 meters. You spread them each 200 meters and they all set seed around the plant the next year. That's a pretty quick expansion in a patch.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other benefit that the farmer I've been talking to has seen has actually been moisture conservation. So he's seeing fewer volunteers in the fall because, say, volunteer canola as example, if you're destroying it in that mill instead of putting it back on your field, you don't have those volunteers come up in the fall. They're not using that moisture.
Right.
So that was a pretty interesting take, actually, when I talked to him. It was like, I hadn't even thought of that part before.
No, it's kind of the unintended benefits of it.
Yeah. So, and then in the United States, there's actually there's a huge amount of work being done on harvest weed seed control in the US for Palmer amaranth control and water hemp control, especially now that they're finding dicamba resistant Palmer and water hemp as well.
Already?
Dicamba Palmer for sure. Yep. Was
Shoot.
confirmed in, I want to say Arkansas just recently, and glufosinate resistant Palmer as well, I believe.
Wow.
So,
And that's
yeah.
extremely you would think it'd be extremely unlikely being such basically a very short-lived herbicide.
Yeah.
In the plant.
Yeah, the glufosinate, I think it's the first broadleaf in the world with resistance to glufosinate, if I have that correct. I think.
Well, it only proves that if you try hard enough, you can develop resistance in just about any weed.
Well, and to just about any tactic too.
Yes.
I mean, we don't harvest weed seed control, even though it's being highly adopted in Australia, they know that they will see adaptations by the weeds to harvest weed seed control. You'll see weeds that shatter earlier. You'll see weeds that are more prostrate and on the ground. That's just, you are putting a selection pressure on, and they will respond. That's there's no real way around that.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the part that hammered that home still the most was in grad school in my master's, because I didn't do an undergrad in ag. So it would have been during my master's. And I want to say it was in Linda Hall's weed science course. And she showed us the picture of barnyard grass that had evolved resistance to hand weeding. So barnyard grass in rice, and it was primarily removed by hand. And so they slowly selected more and more for barnyard grass that looked so similar to the rice that they couldn't tell it apart anymore.
Wow.
Now you can't pull it by hand. That's resistance to hand weeding. Like, weeds are jerks. They respond to whatever we do. Yeah. So I guess the biggest thing for me is that it, even talking about harvest weed seed control, it's something I really do hope to see more producers adopting in Western Canada. But I don't want it to be what replaces herbicides. That's not the intention. It's to add in with herbicides and seeding rates and crop rotation and not this is what I use. What I've been saying to producers lately, and I don't know if they like it very much, is that I'm not researching solutions. I'm not going to solve your problem.
No.
But I am going to try and give you some tools you can use.
Well, and that brings up the whole thing. Just because everything looks like a nail doesn't mean you should use the hammer until it no longer works, right? You should use the entire toolbox and make sure that each tool continues to work and function. Yeah.
And by putting them all into combination, that's your most likely way of keeping them all functional.
Yeah. There is one other way that would work. All you have to do is find out a practical, valuable use for those weed seeds, and then all of a sudden you're going to have problems growing it because the herbicides are too effective.
Yeah, right.
Cow cockle, for example, right?
That's the one I give as an example all the time. Prairie carnation.
Yes.
Yes.
Is anybody growing that?
I don't think so. I don't think that really gained a whole lot of traction, but I'm not positive on that. I actually worked on some projects as a summer student. That was my very first foray into ag research. We did some trials on cow cockle and prairie carnation. So I'm quite familiar with that one.
I remember seeing the plots at Scott's in Saskatchewan.
That's where I worked on them, was as a summer student for Eric. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Breanne. I really appreciate this. This was wonderful, good information. If people wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that? Or do you want people to?
Absolutely. If you want to talk weeds, I'd love to talk weeds.
Okay.
My Twitter handle, I'm quite active on Twitter, so I'm at Breanne Tidemann on Twitter. And I also, my email address, you can probably Google me and find it, but it's breanne.tidemann@canada.ca. So pretty easy to track me down.
Okay, thank you very much, Breanne, and have a good summer. Hopefully get some more research done and you get out in the field.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to checking out all the weeds that are growing and seeing what's coming up as problems in the future. So.
Okay, thank you.